The eggs in Sector 9 had been quiet for 11 days. Petra noticed it the way she noticed most things, not all at once, but in pieces. First, it was the absence of the low subsonic hum that had kept her instruments vibrating slightly in their mounts. Then it was the way the temperature readouts in the incubation wing had stopped fluctuating by even 1/10 of a degree. Then, on the morning of the 12th day, she noticed the silence itself had a texture, something dense and held in, like a breath that had been going on too long. She was 17, and her job title on the official colony manifest was Junior Biomonitor, Xenofauna Division. In practice, this meant she sat in a prefabricated booth at the edge of the Vethali Preserve, watched readout screens for 8 hours at a time, logged anything unusual, and called Senior Biomonitor Oren if it was actually unusual, or just called it a data anomaly if it was probably nothing. She had been doing this for 8 months. She had called Oren exactly twice. Both times it had been something. The booth smelled like recycled air and the particular burnt plastic smell of equipment that had been running too long. There was a crack in the corner of the observation window that nobody had fixed, sealed with a strip of grey tape that had been there since before Petra arrived. She had put a small sticker over one end of it, a yellow sun with a face, the kind children put on things, not because it helped the seal, but because it made the crack look like it was going somewhere on purpose. Outside, the preserve stretched for 2 kilometers before hitting the electrostatic barrier. Inside that barrier, the Vethali nested. There were 16 of them, adults, arranged in what the xenobiologists had categorized as a loose territorial cluster, though Petra privately thought the word cluster didn't do justice to the specific and deliberate geometry of how they positioned themselves. She had begun to think of it as a courtroom. Each adult faced a slightly different direction, and the angles, when you overlaid them on the map, formed a rough star. At the center of that star sat the nest mound. The eggs, there had been 4 of them, were registered in the colonial database as Vethali Clutch 7. 3 had failed in the first weeks. The 4th had persisted, growing slowly warmer, and the adults had begun spending more time near it, which the senior xenobiologists had flagged as a positive sign of viability. Then the humming had stopped. Petra pulled up the thermal overlay on her secondary screen and looked at the clutch mound for a long moment. The egg registered at 38.4 degrees Celsius. That was within normal range. The external sensors weren't showing any movement or sound event that would explain the silence stopping. She logged a notation, subsonic activity ceased, day 12. No clear trigger, monitoring. She reached for her water and looked out the observation window instead of at the screen. That was when she saw the crack in the mound. It was thin, almost invisible, running diagonally across the upper surface. She watched it for 3 full seconds before she understood what she was seeing, and then she was on her feet with her face against the glass, her water rolling off the desk behind her, and she was thinking very clearly. She should call Oren. She should log the event. She should not go outside. She pulled on her environment jacket, keyed her personal ID into the door panel, and went outside. The air was cooler than the booth and smelled like rust and the particular chemical tang the Vethali gave off, something between ozone and iron. The adults shifted when she stepped out. She knew they could see her, their visual spectrum was broad, and she was a bright thermal signature in a cold landscape. She walked slowly, not because she was unafraid, but because she had learned that slow movement in the presence of Vethali was less provocative than stillness. Stillness, their behavioral files said, was what prey did. She stopped 6 meters from the mound. The crack had widened. The adults had pulled back slightly, not away from the mound, away from her. She registered that as important. She filed it in the part of her brain that kept running calculations even when the front of her mind was occupied with the thing happening right in front of her, which was the egg breaking open. It didn't shatter, it unfolded. The shell material separated in overlapping sections, each one falling outward in a slow, deliberate pattern, like a flower opening in reverse slow motion. And from the center of it, small and wet and staring at nothing in particular, rose the Vethali infant. It was roughly the size of a large dog. Its scales were pale gray, almost translucent at the edges, and they hadn't fully hardened. She could see the blue tracery of circulatory structures beneath them. Its neck was disproportionately long. Its wings were folded tight against its back in a way that made it look almost wingless, just a ridge of compressed membrane. Its eyes, when they finally focused on something, focused on her. She stood completely still. She had forgotten her own rule. The infant made a sound. It wasn't a roar or a cry. It was a soft, percussive ticking, like a cooling engine, and it came from somewhere in its chest. She had never heard a Vethali infant vocalize. There was no data on infant vocalizations. She was standing in the middle of an undocumented behavioral event with no backup and her communicator still on the desk. The adults hadn't moved. The infant took one step toward her, then stopped. One of its front feet was slightly turned inward. It put weight on it anyway, which told her something about stubbornness that she didn't have language for yet. It looked at her with its pale, wide eyes and made the ticking sound again. She crouched down slowly, her hands loose at her sides, and she said the only thing she could think of to say, which was nothing at all. She just made herself smaller. She breathed steadily. She met those eyes without flinching. The infant sat down, not because it trusted her. She could see in the set of its neck muscles that it didn't trust her. It sat down because it was tired and newly born, and the world was very large, and she was the only thing in it that wasn't moving. She heard her communicator buzz from inside the booth, probably Oren checking her morning log. She didn't move. The sky above the preserve was the pale yellow of early day, and the adults had arranged themselves in their star formation again, and somewhere in the geometry of their attention Petra was included now, though she didn't know yet what that meant. She just knew that the small creature in front of her was still watching her, still making its quiet ticking sound at intervals that were slowly lengthening, like a clock winding down into something calmer. She would call Oren when the infant was asleep. She would explain everything. She would use the correct terminology, file the correct forms, and she would not mention that when she had seen those translucent scales and the turned-in foot, the very first thing she had felt was not caution or professional interest. It was recognition. Oren arrived the following morning and looked at the footage for 40 minutes without speaking. He was a methodical man, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of patience that people sometimes confused with slowness. He had been studying Vethali for 9 years. He rewound the footage twice, stopped it at the moment Petra crouched down, and then finally turned to look at her. "You went outside," he said. "I did. Without your communicator. I left it on the desk." He looked at the screen again. The infant was visible in the corner of frame, still within sight of the mound, but a full 3 meters closer to the barrier fence than it had been the previous afternoon. It's moving away from the clutch site faster than any documented infant. That's not normal patterning. "I know. It keeps looking toward the booth." She didn't say anything. Oren pulled up the adult behavioral logs and cross-referenced the movement data, and Petra watched him work and noticed the small vertical line that appeared between his eyebrows when he was thinking through something he didn't want to say yet. She had catalogued that line over 8 months. It appeared before significant statements. "The adults haven't redirected it," he said finally. "They should be pulling it back to the mound. Standard infant behavior for clutch 3 and 5 was a minimum of 14 days in close proximity to the clutch site. This one walked toward the fence in the first hour." "Walked toward where you were?" "Yes." He closed the behavioral logs and looked at her directly. "You understand what the protocol says. Observation only, no direct contact. If the infant is showing anomalous attachment behavior, we document it and report it to Central Xenobiology. We do not encourage it." She nodded. That was all she said. She nodded and looked at the observation window, where the infant was currently sitting in the exact center of the preserve, equidistant from every adult and looking at the booth. Oren left in the early afternoon to file his preliminary report. He told her to log everything, maintain standard observation distance, and not go outside again without a second person present and her communicator charged. She told him she understood. At 3 in the afternoon, The infant pressed its nose against the base of the electrostatic barrier and made a sound that her instruments barely registered. A frequency so low it was more vibration than sound, and Petra felt it in her back teeth before she saw the readout spike. She had felt that frequency before. It was the same register as the hum that had gone quiet 11 days ago. She wrote that down. She stared at the notation for a long moment, then added a line beneath it, infant vocalizing at clutch hum frequency. Hypothesis, same signal type, testing unknown. Then she wrote a third line smaller in the margin where it wasn't technically part of the log. It's calling something. She crossed out that last line, put her pen down, picked it up again and wrote it back. The infant stayed at the barrier for 2 more hours. When it finally turned and walked back toward the adults, it moved with a slight favoring of that turned-in front foot, putting weight on the outer edge instead of the pad, and Petra watched the walk and thought about the specific quality of a creature that learns its own body in real time, working out through trial and repetition what compensations to make, and keeps moving anyway. She did not go outside, but she left the booth door slightly open so the sound of the preserve could come in, and worked the rest of her shift with the faint chemical iron smell of the air around her, and every time the infant made its low subsonic sound, she heard it in her teeth and logged the time. She didn't let herself think about what it meant that the sound felt familiar, that in some part of her that had nothing to do with training or protocol, it felt like an answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. She was 17, and she knew the difference between what was scientifically documentable and what was just something she felt, and she was very careful, most of the time, to keep those categories separate. She filed her end-of-day log. She called it complete. She went back to the residential block and ate a meal she didn't taste and looked at the ceiling of her small room for an hour before sleeping, and in the morning she went back to the booth. The infant was already at the barrier when she arrived. 6 weeks after the hatching, the infant had a name in the official logs, Clutch 7 Viable, Specimen 1, and in Petra's private notebook it had a different name, which was set, because of the way it settled itself when it sat, a careful and deliberate lowering of weight like a stone finding the bottom of still water. She had not named it out loud. She had not told Oren. It existed only in the notebook, in the handwriting she used for her own thoughts rather than official records, a slightly smaller and less regular hand that she'd been told was illegible by 2 different teachers in 2 different schools. Set had grown. The translucent quality of the scales was fading as they hardened, settling into the gray-green that the adults carried, though with a pale silver undertone at the edges that none of the adults had. The xenobiologists who'd visited from Central, 3 of them, over 2 separate trips, had noted this as a possible indicator of juvenile coloration that would fade with maturity. Petra had written down their conclusion in her log and disagreed with it privately because the color wasn't dimming over time. It was intensifying. The turned-in foot had not corrected itself. Set had compensated almost completely. You had to know to look for it, but the inner pad of that foot wore differently than the others, and some mornings Petra could see a slight hesitation before Set's first steps, a recalibration, as if the body needed to remind itself which adjustments to make before it could trust its own weight. The adults had begun doing something new in the past 2 weeks. They had extended the star formation, each one shifting outward by roughly 8 meters, which effectively widened the open space at the center of the preserve. The xenobiologists from Central had called this a territorial expansion response, typical of clutch viability confirmation. Petra had logged their conclusion and then logged a second observation directly beneath it. Center of expanded formation aligns with barrier point closest to observation booth. No prior formation has centered on the barrier. She hadn't sent that second observation to anyone. On the morning that changed things, she arrived to find Set not at the barrier, but lying flat against the ground 15 meters inside the preserve, wings spread, which was a posture she had never observed before. The adults were arranged around it in a rough ring, each one facing outward, and there was a quality to their stillness that she recognized as different from resting stillness. It was the stillness of waiting. She stood at the observation window for a long time. Then she went outside, slowly, leaving her communicator on the desk, and stopped just beyond the booth door. Set raised its head. Even from 15 meters, she could see the color in those eyes, which were pale gold with a vertical pupil that, in the current light, had expanded almost to full width. The iris made the eye look very soft. She had read in the behavioral files that Vethali pupil dilation in response to stimuli indicated heightened neurological engagement, which was science's way of saying attention, and she chose to read it that way. She sat down in the dirt just outside the booth, cross-legged, and looked back. Set made the low ticking sound. Then it got up, with that slight hesitation on the turned-in foot, that recalibration she now knew like she knew the sound of her own heartbeat, and walked toward her. The adults didn't move. Set stopped 2 meters away and lowered its head until its chin was almost touching the ground, and Petra, who had read everything available on Vethali body language, found nothing in any file that described this posture. It wasn't submission. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't a threat display. It was something she had no category for, and she was deciding what to do about that when Set's head came up again, and Set looked at her with those wide, soft gold eyes, and made a sound she had also never heard before. Not ticking, something longer and more continuous, with a shape to it, almost like a question. She reached out one hand, slowly, palm up, and held it there. She didn't reach toward Set. She just held her hand open in the space between them and waited to see what would happen. What happened was that Set pressed its nose against her palm. The scales were cool and smooth and slightly rough at the edges, like a river stone, and the breath from Set's nostrils was warm against her wrist. Petra held completely still. Her heart was doing something unusual that she categorized privately as not fear. The contact lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then Set pulled back, looked at her, and made the questioning sound again. She thought without meaning to, "I hear you." The morning light was coming through the barrier fence in long angled bars, and she was sitting in the dirt of an alien preserve with no communicator and no backup, and a juvenile Vethali with a crooked foot had just asked her something she didn't have words for yet. She thought she might spend a long time finding them. The message from Central Xenobiology arrived while Petra was in the middle of her afternoon log, and it was addressed to Oren, and he brought it to the booth rather than call because he wanted to watch her face when she read it. She read it twice. The Colonial Environmental Management Board, in conjunction with Central Xenobiology and the Colonial Development Authority, had completed their 6-week assessment of Vethali Clutch 7. Their conclusion was that the viable infant, exhibiting anomalous behavioral patterns, including atypical barrier proximity behavior and possible imprinting responses to human contact, represented a case requiring managed intervention. Per Protocol 7C regarding potentially compromised wild specimen development, Specimen 1 was to be transferred to the Central Research Facility on Station Morin for full behavioral and physiological assessment. The transfer was scheduled for 3 weeks from the date of the message. Petra set the document down carefully on the desk. Outside the window, Set was in the center of the preserve, doing the thing it had started doing in the past week, packing a specific route that Petra had mapped and found, on examination, to be a slightly irregular oval that always brought it back to face the booth. The adults watched the packing without interfering. "You should have reported the direct contact," Oren said. He said it quietly, without accusation. "I know. The imprinting notation is from my initial report. I flagged the proximity behavior. I didn't know about the physical contact." "I know." He pulled a chair to the desk and sat down across from her. "Petra, Central isn't doing this to punish either of us. They believe the specimen's development is being shaped by the contact, and they think removal to a controlled environment is in the animal's interest." "It's not imprinting," she said. "The behavior profile." "Oren," she looked at him, "I've been watching Set every day for 6 weeks. It's not imprinting. It knows what I am. It's not confused about that. It doesn't think I'm its parent or its clutchmate. It just—" She stopped. She looked at the window. Set had paused in its oval and was looking at the booth. "It just keeps choosing to be near me." He was quiet for a moment. That might be worse from a management standpoint. She stood up and walked to the window and put her hand flat against the glass, not thinking about it. Set, across the preserve, raised its head. It couldn't see her gesture from that distance, but it made the long, questioning sound, the one she'd started thinking of as a greeting. "If they take it to Moran," she said, "it'll be in an enclosure by itself. No clutch, no preserve, no adults. The facility is well regarded." "I know what the facility is. I looked it up. The longest survival for a solitary juvenile Vethali in a controlled environment is 14 months. Orin didn't answer that. She turned around. "I want to write a counter-assessment. I want to document the behavioral patterns in full, with my own analysis, and submit it alongside your report. I want it on record that what's happening isn't specimen compromise, it's the opposite." He looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through something, the same careful pace he brought to everything. "If you submit a counter-assessment, Central will want to know why it wasn't in the initial report. They'll ask about the contact you didn't disclose." "I know. You could lose the position." "I know," she said again. Her voice was steady. She was a little surprised by that, but she didn't let the surprise show. Outside, Set had started its oval packing again, the slight hitch on the turned-in foot now visible even from this distance in the particular quality of the stride, the way a body learns to make peace with the shape it has. "Give me the template," she said. "I'll start tonight." Orin held her gaze for another moment, then stood up and pulled a file from the system. He placed it on the desk between them, tapped it once and said, "Use clear language, no emotion. Make it about the data." "It is about the data." "Then it should be easy," he said, and left her to it. She opened the template and stared at the blank first page. She could hear Set's subsonic sound coming through the cracked window, barely there, a frequency she felt more than heard. She put her hands on the keyboard. She wrote, "The behavioral designation of imprinting is applied when a juvenile specimen forms a species-atypical attachment based on misidentification of the attachment figure. I submit that no such misidentification is occurring in specimen 1. What follows is a full account of observed behaviors, including direct contact events not previously reported." She kept going. She wrote for 4 hours. She used clear language. She used the data. Outside, Set paced its oval in the fading light, and the adults arranged themselves in their star, and the preserve was quiet except for the sound Petra felt in her teeth, which she had stopped pretending was just a frequency. The 2 officers from Central arrived in the early morning, a week before the scheduled transfer date, which was unexpected. They brought a portable enclosure unit and a sedation certification and a data tablet with the transfer order stamped in triplicate. Their names were Voss and Wren. Voss did most of the talking. Wren carried the equipment. Orin met them at the facility entrance. Petra was already in the booth. She had read her counter-assessment 3 times the night before, looking for weaknesses. She had found some and patched them. She had filed it to Central 6 days ago and received an automated acknowledgement and nothing since. Now she sat in the booth with both hands on the desk and watched Orin walk the 2 officers toward the preserve and thought about the 14 months. Voss stopped at the barrier fence and looked out at the preserve. Set was at the far edge, near one of the adult clusters, doing something Petra had been logging for the past 3 days, pressing the side of its head against the flank of one of the large adults, slowly, repeatedly, with what she had annotated as apparent investigative intent. The adult allowed it. "Which one is the juvenile?" Voss asked. Orin pointed. "Small," Voss said. "The transfer sedative should be well within tolerance for that body weight." Petra stood up and walked outside. Orin saw her coming, and his expression shifted in a way she recognized, not warning, exactly, Maury-like preparation. She stopped beside him and looked at Voss directly. My counter-assessment was filed 6 days ago, she said. Has Central reviewed it? Voss looked at her. He was older than she'd expected, with the careful, impersonal face of someone who had done this kind of transfer many times and had learned not to let the variables affect the procedure. You're the junior monitor. Petra, yes. The counter-assessment is being reviewed. The review timeline is 4 to 6 weeks. The transfer order predates the assessment filing and hasn't been suspended pending review. So you're proceeding. That's correct. She nodded. She looked out at the preserve. Set had lifted its head from the adult's flank and was looking toward the booth, which it did with regularity now. The pale silver at the edge of its scales caught the morning light, and she thought about what she'd written in her assessment. The color is not juvenile marking. It is individual marking. I have found no record of silver-margined scales in any documented Vethali specimen. This individual is not a variant of the pattern. It is the pattern. If you sedate it without the adults showing submission posture, she said, you'll trigger a defensive formation. 14 adults in full defensive formation is not a situation your sedation cert covers. Voss looked at her calmly. We have a wildlife management protocol for adult defensive response. Your protocol involves aerial deterrent dispersal from a distance of, she had looked this up, no less than 60 meters. The preserve is 120 meters in diameter. The dispersal system will cover the full preserve, which is within acceptable parameters for temporary adult sedation. And the juvenile. A pause, small, but there. She pressed it gently. The juvenile is smaller than an adult by approximately 40%. The dispersal dosage calibrated for adults will deliver roughly 1.4 times the appropriate dose for a juvenile at this developmental stage. She had done this math at 2 in the morning, 3 nights ago, after rereading the wildlife management protocol. She had redone it twice to make sure. Juvenile Vethali lung development at 6 weeks post-hatch is approximately 62% of adult capacity. An overdose of that magnitude applied to underdeveloped respiratory function has a documented outcome. The silence was longer this time. Set had walked to the barrier while she was talking, not to the nearest fence line, to the spot it always chose, the one directly in front of the booth. It pressed its nose lightly against the barrier field, which made a faint shimmer visible in the air, and looked at her with its gold eyes. Voss looked at the juvenile, then at his tablet, then at Petra. Wren had not spoken once during the entire exchange. She was looking at Set with an expression that Petra categorized as something other than professional neutrality. The transfer protocol requires adult compliance, Voss said slowly. If an aerial deterrent presents risk to the juvenile, the protocol requires alternative compliance methodology. Which would take how long to authorize? Another pause, minimum 14 days. She held his gaze steadily. She felt the low sound of Set's signal in her back teeth, and she thought very clearly, hold. Then I'd suggest, she said, that you wait on the review of my counter-assessment. Orin, beside her, said nothing. He had not said anything during the entire exchange. But she felt him, beside her, not moving, and that was enough. Voss looked at the preserve for a long time. He looked at the adults, arranged in their star with its center point fixed on the barrier fence. He looked at the juvenile with its face against the shimmer of the barrier. He looked at his tablet once more, then closed it. I'll request a protocol assessment before proceeding, he said. 14 days. He turned and walked back toward the facility entrance. Wren followed, but looked back once at Set, and then at Petra with that expression that Petra had decided to call what it was, which was, I didn't know it would look like that. Orin exhaled once quietly and said nothing at all. Petra turned back to the preserve. Set was still at the barrier, still looking at her, making the questioning sound in that low, continuous way that had long since stopped seeming like a question and started seeming like a statement. She walked to the fence and crouched down, close enough to see the silver at the edge of the scales catching the light. 14 days, she said, to no one in particular. Set pressed against the barrier shimmer and blinked at her slowly. The slow blink she had noted in her assessment was documented in adults as a low arousal comfort signal. She had never found it documented for juveniles. She wrote it down now in her head for later. The formal review board met on Station Morin 18 days after Voss and Wren's visit, and Petra was invited to attend by secured comm. She sat in the booth to do it, with her screen propped at the angle that caught the least glare, and outside the window set was moving through its oval while the adults held their formation. The board had 4 members, 2 senior xenobiologists, 1 colonial environmental representative, and 1 animal welfare officer whose name was Adele and who had reviewed Petra's counter-assessment 3 times and sent her a communication 4 days before the meeting that said only, "The silver margining section is the strongest part. Make sure they look at those photographs." She had sent 7 photographs. Adele had put them in the presentation herself. The board asked Petra 12 questions. She answered 11 of them directly. The 12th was whether she believed her own objectivity was compromised by the nature of her contact with the specimen, and she said, after a moment, "I think my objectivity is what I make it. I've been careful about what goes into the log and what goes into my notebook. If the board wants to see the notebook, I'll send it." There was a silence, then Adele said, "That won't be necessary." The deliberation took 40 minutes. Petra logged Set's behaviors during that time because she needed something to do with her hands and her attention. Set was doing the packing oval, but more slowly than usual, and twice paused to look toward the booth in a way that felt, to her, different from the routine check. Longer. She logged it as extended visual orientation toward observation point, possible response to handler behavioral cues. No prior documentation of this sensitivity in juvenile specimens. The board returned and delivered the following. The transfer order was suspended pending completion of a full independent behavioral assessment to be conducted by a central-approved researcher over a period of not less than 90 days. During the assessment period, the specimen would remain in the Vethali Preserve. The junior biomonitor assigned to Sector 9, name noted in the formal record, was granted continued observation access, with a formal caution regarding undisclosed contact events and a notation that the subsequent full disclosure demonstrated the kind of professional integrity the division valued in its personnel. Petra read that last part twice. She closed the comm and sat in the booth for a while, not logging anything, just sitting. Outside, Set had stopped its oval and was lying down in the center of the preserve, wings folded, chin on the ground, in the posture that the adult behavioral files described as resting comfort. It was a posture she had never seen Set use before. She thought about what it might mean for a 6-week-old creature to have learned the body language of rest, to lie down like you trust the ground. Orin came by in the late afternoon. She told him the outcome and he listened and nodded and said, "The silver margining argument, that's what got them." He paused. "And the respiratory math." "Both," she said. He looked out the window at the preserve. Set was still lying down, and 2 of the adults had moved closer, not surrounding, just adjacent, in a casual way that Petra found herself wanting to call companionable. "What happens in 90 days?" Orin asked. "The independent researcher submits their assessment. Based on that, the board decides whether to reclassify the management protocol. And if they don't reclassify..." She was quiet for a moment. "Then I file again," she said, "and I keep filing." He looked at her with that expression that she had learned, over 8 months, was the closest Orin came to saying something he found hard to say out loud. "You should know," he said, "that I included a personal note in the board packet about your observational work this season." He cleared his throat. It was positive. She looked at him. He had already turned back to the window. They stood there together for a while, looking out at the preserve in the amber light of late afternoon, and Set was lying in the center of it all with the silver at the edges of its scales catching the sun, and the adults were arranged around it in their wide, slow star, and the subsonic hum had come back into the air 3 weeks ago and had been building gently ever since, and Petra felt it now in her chest rather than her teeth, which she had decided to log as a change in frequency. which was technically accurate, and which was also the only way she knew how to write down the fact that something had shifted inside the sound. She stayed until the light changed. She logged the time. She noted that Specimen 1 had maintained resting comfort posture for 2 hours and 14 minutes, which was, to her knowledge, the longest sustained rest documented for a juvenile Vethali in the presence of a human observer. She closed her log and set down her pen and looked out through the cracked window, with its tape and its small yellow sun sticker pointing the way, and Set was still lying in the last of the light, wings folded, one front foot turned slightly inward, breathing steadily in the way of a creature that has decided, at least for now, to trust the ground beneath it.